Hey everyone, Zach here. Today I'm going to talk through a new use case I've been building out to do custom AP reporting. And in this post, I kind of open it up with a description of automation analytics, which is similar to Red Hat Insights for RHEL if you've used that in the past. But my point I'm trying to make there is that if you do have the ability to connect your Ansible Automation Platform instance to automation analytics, which is a service provided by Red Hat, then you should certainly do so and kind of move on from this post because it's not as useful for you. But I went ahead and built this out because a lot of customers do have restrictions when it comes to sending data across the wire and sending things back to Red Hat. So in those scenarios, you still have the data available to you. You just don't have the analytics and dashboards all provided for you by Red Hat, so you can build them out yourself. What I decided to do was, for a customer that was in that situation, was build out an example and hopefully establish a pattern that could be repeated for other dashboards or reports that may be of interest to customers. So in this example, what I did was I'm going to use a lookup plugin to essentially gather the data in a structured data model, and that could be leveraged downstream in various ways. In my case, the pattern I'm going to use is a lookup plugin to gather the data model, and then a role to actually build out a static HTML report and publish that to a report server. So trying to decouple the two, where if you just want to pull the data into a JSON object and kind of have it available to you, you could forward that somewhere else and parse it however you want. In my case, I'm going to use it to forward it to that role, which will generate a report, and I'll show that. So the high level implementation, I really didn't do too much. I decided to go the lookup plugin route because there is some data wrangling I was doing, and you can do that in Ansible with successive tasks, right? So this could have been a role itself, but I don't know. I find it much easier to do that in Python and much clearer. And the lookup plugin is a really easy interface for consumers who want to actually leverage this logic in their own playbooks to do so. It's just a little bit simpler than a role. So what I do is I actually reuse the module utilities from the Ansible.controller collection, which its upstream is awx.awx if you use that. So that actually does most of the heavy lifting for me. The controller API module utilities has all of the work for interacting with the controller API, which is where the data is going to be pulled from, ultimately coming from the AWX PostgreSQL database that sits behind your controller instance. The next step is I wrote out the documentation for the lookup plugin. I actually learned in this process how important that is because the plugin framework in Ansible actually parses that documentation and leverages it to set certain expected attributes and things that you can use when implementing the plugin itself. So I say don't skip this step or take it lightly because you'll end up running into errors with unexpected options or missing options, things like that. And then I actually go through and do my steps. So I pull the organizations using the controller API utilities. I pull all the associated inventories with each organization. And then lastly, I pull the hosts associated to inventories. And that way I'm able to stratify this data for someone who's interested, right? Instead of just seeing the instance-wide host usage, you can actually break it down by the organization and inventories those hosts are a part of. And then the last part of the plugin is actually kind of doing that analysis, right? It's stratifying things and then looking at some of the properties of the host to determine, has it been automated against, has it failed, things like that. So the usage you'll actually see here is, like I said, I tried to keep it super simple. Is you just use this lookup in the name of the lookup plugin. It's in my ZJ LeBlanc utils collection and org host metrics. You can pass a keyword parameter called names with an array of names, and that will filter down to a list of organizations. So if you don't want to, if you have 20 organizations, you only want to look at 2 or 3, you can provide a list of those names, and it will filter the results back. You may be wondering, so how do you know what the data model looks like? So what I'll first do is I'll hop into the plugin itself just to give an idea of what that looks like. The interface into a lookup module and I always start with an existing one. So you can start with mine if you want to build your own out. Um, but the entry point here is this run function, um, and the header here is going to be, you know, it's going to remain unchanged. So what determines the actual options are going to be that documentation. So if I scroll up here, you'll see I've defined as one of my options that names array. I said it's a list type, right? And it's got, you know, the host metrics will only be gathered for the organizations provided. It's not required. So no need to change the function definition here. What you'll do is you'll access the options via um, this function called self.getOptions. Um, so I'll keep scrolling down here. You'll see that I also go ahead and process the controller API parameters because I extend the documentation for my lookup plugin with the module utilities so that all those available as well. So like the API credentials, so thinking like the controller host, the controller username, password, or token, things like that. So I go ahead and process those here. And then I set up my modules. So that's going to be my actual reference to the controller API. And I save that on my lookup module. And then I kind of actually dive into the steps. So you'll see it's not too crazy. So the first thing I do is I'm going to go ahead and get all the organizations. If I go into this private function here, you'll see this is where I'm actually leveraging the module utilities. And there's a function called get endpoint. The endpoint is going to be the organization endpoints, and then I can provide a query. So here I'm going to give the organization ID to filter it down. And then there's just some additional logic to handle paging and things like that. So I scroll back up here. Sorry about that. So I've got my organizations now. I'm then going to I'm going to pull that option I talked about. So the names, so I'm going to get that option, and if it has a value, great. If it doesn't, it's none. And if it does have a value, I'm going to go ahead and just filter down that result I got from the API and only include the organizations that we're interested in. So the next step is going to be to loop through those orgs, right? And I wrote a private function, right, that gets an organization level metrics for each org and appends it to this list of results, which is ultimately what comes back to the user. Without getting too into the weeds, the org metrics is going to basically first get all the inventories for that particular org, loop over those, get each host and its data for each inventory, and then it's going to do analysis on a particular host. That's kind of where the logic lives. So in the analysis phase, if I scroll down, we've got this get host flags function where this is where it's looking at like, okay, does the host have a last job? That means if it does, it's been automated against. If it hasn't, then it's not been automated against, right? So you haven't used that subscription. Then there is a has active failures actually property on the payload. And then of course there's an enabled property. So that's how I'm setting those flags, and then I'm returning them back. If you're curious as to how I knew what those were, everybody has access to a walkable API in their instance. So you just go to /API/v2. I clicked on the host's link, and then I can see a payload, right? So this is my host results, and I can see what the body looks like. So I can tell for a particular host, I get all this information. So I get the name of the host, is it enabled, last job, right? So if that's null, then I know that it hasn't been automated against, does it have failures, things like that. So that's the information I use to build out my report. So I come back here. The next thing I talk about is kind of sprucing that up, right? So it's one thing to just pull back a data model. That's great, and you can leverage it that way if you want. It's very simple. But I wanted to throw it into a report. So what I did is I built out a role. Sorry, this is the lookup plugin. So these documentation is linked on the post itself. If I go one over here, I got a role, and the role is pretty simple. It basically takes an optional, remote host, so you can give it a report server to publish a report to. There's some configurable options to use to customize the output of the report, and there's some example playbooks to show you what to do. But the end goal, if I come here, right, this is a very simple playbook that does both steps, right? It looks up the org host metrics and it templates out a report. So what it's doing here is it's including my role. The data, it's going to use the lookup plugin to get the data for the role. It's going to define the remote host, and then a destination. So this is kind of my web route for that particular host. Um, and once I run that, the output is here. So this is what the report looks like. I filtered it down to 2 orgs in my instance. I've got Autodotes as my org, and then the default org. What you can see here is I've got organization level metrics. So these are the hosts imported for the entire org, automated, failed, and disabled. And if I come over to the right here, it's actually stratified by the inventories themselves. And then these are all actually active links. So if you click on them, that'll take you to the resource in your controller instance. One thing to note is if you actually add some of these up for imported, I put a little footnote here that it's unique. So this actually adds up to 19, but that's because 2 of these inventories actually have localhost as an entry. So just keeping in mind that this subtotal here is not always going to be exactly added up to the number of imported there. And if I do default, kind of see, you can kind of switch between your orgs, and you should have a similar view for each org. So I hope you enjoyed this and are able to use it. I think if you really want to step into it, it's just making sure you have my ZJ LeBlanc utilities collection and my ZJ LeBlanc reporting collection. And then in theory, you should be able to just leverage this playbook and tweak it to fit your needs. And then the only other thing is making sure that you have the controller credential to inject into like the secrets for your controller host or your controller authentication. And that can be done via a job template in your AAP instance. So if I go to my controller my controller, I can actually pull up the job template for this. I pull this up here. You'll see I've got my playbook I'm pointing to that was the one I just showed, and then I've got credentials. So I've got an SSH credential, that's for the report server, and then I've got my controller credential. So that's going to be what allows the lookup plugin to work, right? Because it's going to leverage those environment variables to authenticate with the API. As always, feel free to drop a note in the comments if you have any questions on how to use this. And then I hope that, in the future, if you come across this desire to have some reporting, that you can use this as a pattern, even if it doesn't, organization level host metrics may not be your exact use case, but the pattern should work for, however you need to manipulate the data and build out your own lookup plugins.